The Atlantic was unforgiving in the winter of 1942. Steel-gray waves rose and collapsed like walls, slamming into the sides of merchant ships already scarred by fire and rust. Convoys moved slowly, stretched thin across hundreds of miles of open water, each vessel carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and men desperately needed on the other side. Somewhere beneath the surface, German U-boats waited in silence. They did not need to win the war outright. They only needed to sink ships faster than Britain and her allies could replace them. By the numbers alone, the situation was approaching collapse. Month after month, tonnage lost climbed higher. Entire crews vanished into freezing darkness. Survivors spoke of torpedoes striking without warning, of ships breaking apart in minutes, of the sound of screaming metal followed by screaming men. British Naval Command calculated that at current loss rates, the country had only weeks of essential supplies left. If the Atlantic lifeline failed, everything else would fail with it. The escorts did what doctrine demanded. Destroyers zigzagged, sonar operators strained their ears, depth charges were dropped into empty water again and again. Sometimes they worked, often they did not. The U-boats were adapting faster than the Allies. They learned to hide beneath thermal layers, to sit motionless on the seabed, to let convoys pass overhead while remaining unseen. The ocean itself seemed to protect them. Inside the escort ships, tension never fully lifted. Men slept in short bursts, boots on, jackets never removed. Every unusual vibration, every change in engine tone, every false sonar contact set nerves on edge. Officers trusted the manuals, engineers trusted their instruments. When the instruments said nothing was there, command moved on, and somewhere behind them, another ship burned. On HMS Redbridge, an aging escort vessel patched together after earlier damage, the most overlooked man aboard worked below decks in the galley. His name was Thomas Riley. Officially, he was a naval cook. His duties were simple: keep the crew fed, keep morale alive, keep the coffee hot during endless watches. No one asked his opinion about sonar, engines, or submarine warfare. No one expected insight from a man whose hands smelled of grease and boiled vegetables. Before the war, Riley ran a small diner near Liverpool. It barely survived the Depression. He fixed broken radios for extra money, not because he had formal training, but because he liked understanding how things worked. Sound fascinated him. Static, interference, the way signals changed when conditions shifted. He never thought it would matter beyond keeping music playing for customers. Aboard the Redbridge, Riley listened more than he spoke. The galley sat close enough to the engine spaces that vibrations passed through the metal floor. He felt changes in rhythm before they were announced. He noticed how the ship sounded different at various speeds, how certain engine patterns made the hull hum in a way that rattled cookware and made conversation harder. Most men ignored it. Riley did not. One night, during a convoy run through particularly dangerous waters, alarms sounded again. Sonar had picked up nothing, yet a merchant ship ahead erupted in fire. A torpedo strike. Clean, precise. The U-boat escaped before depth charges could be brought to bear. In the aftermath, exhausted officers reviewed logs and sonar recordings. Nothing unusual stood out. No warning, no clear contact. Riley listened from the doorway. He had heard something. Not the submarine itself, but the way the ship had masked the ocean. The engine noise at cruising speed created a constant blanket of sound. To trained operators, it was normal. To Riley, it felt wrong, like trying to hear a whisper while standing beside a running generator. He mentioned it quietly to a petty officer he trusted, suggested that maybe the ship was drowning out its own ears. The response was polite but dismissive. Sonar was complex. The systems were designed by experts. Noise was accounted for. A cook did not understand underwater acoustics better than naval engineers. Riley let it drop, for a time. Days later, another convoy came under attack, another ship lost, another failure to detect the threat in time. The frustration aboard Redbridge turned sharp. Men began to whisper that they were sailing blind, that the ocean belonged to the enemy. Riley started experimenting on his own, listening carefully during engine changes ordered for routine maneuvers. When speed fluctuated, the background noise shifted. Briefly, the ship felt quieter, not because the engines were silent, but because the constant rhythm broke. In those moments, even untrained ears could sense depth and distance more clearly. The idea that formed in his mind sounded absurd. Intentionally altering engine noise during operations went against everything he'd been taught about stealth and consistency. Ships were supposed to minimize sound, not play with it. But Riley wasn't thinking like a naval tactician. He was thinking like a man tuning a radio, twisting the dial until the interference fell away and the signal emerged. When he tried to explain this to an officer, the reaction was sharper. Sonar doctrine did not come from diners and broken radios. Changing engine patterns during escort operations risked confusion, mechanical strain, and discipline issues. He was told firmly to focus on his duties. Then came the night everything nearly went wrong. The convoy was crossing a narrow stretch of ocean known for heavy U-boat activity. Weather was poor, visibility was low. Shortly after midnight, sonar reported faint, inconsistent contacts, too weak to classify. Moments later, torpedoes struck two ships almost simultaneously. Fires lit the sea, screams carried across the waves. Depth charges were dropped blindly. The submarine vanished. In the aftermath, Redbridge was ordered to remain on station, guarding survivors. Engines shifted constantly as the ship maneuvered. Riley stood frozen in the galley, heart pounding. For a brief window, amid the erratic engine noise, the ocean sounded different, clearer, almost exposed. He ran. Bursting onto the bridge uninvited was a career-ending move for a cook. Riley did it anyway. He shouted over the din, words tumbling out, explaining as best he could. Change the engine rhythm, short bursts, irregular intervals, force the noise to move instead of sit like a wall. Silence followed, then anger, then disbelief. But the officer of the watch looked at the burning water around them and made a choice born of desperation. "Try it," he said. 5 minutes. Engines shifted. Not smoothly, not predictably. The steady hum fractured into even, uneven pulses. Sonar operators stared at their screens as the background clutter thinned. Not entirely, but enough. A contact appeared. Clear, moving. The U-boat, attempting to reposition under the assumption that it was still hidden, had exposed itself. Depth charges rolled off the stern moments later. The sea erupted. When the oil surfaced, the bridge went quiet. Over the next hours, 2 more contacts emerged under similar conditions. 2 more submarines destroyed. Word spread quickly, not as official doctrine, but as a whispered trick. Change the noise, break the rhythm, force the enemy to move. Naval Command demanded explanations. Engineers objected. Manuals did not mention this. Riley was summoned, uncomfortable in his uniform, struggling to put instinct into language. He spoke of interference, of masking, of how constant noise could hide other sounds better than silence ever could. Tests followed. The results were undeniable. Convoys that adopted irregular engine patterns during high-risk zones reported increased detections. U-boats accustomed to predictable sound environments made mistakes. Losses dropped. Escorts became hunters again. The Germans noticed. Reports spoke of unnatural detection, of ships that seemed to hear through the ocean itself. Countermeasures were attempted, but the advantage had shifted. Riley never received a medal ceremony. His contribution was quietly folded into revised procedures, attributed to operational refinements. When the war ended, he returned home, reopened his diner, and fixed radios for neighbors. Few ever knew what he had done, but thousands of sailors lived because a cook listened differently. Wars are not always turned by grand strategies or brilliant commanders. Sometimes they're turned by ordinary men who notice a flaw everyone else accepts and dare to break the rhythm.